It's Sunday, March 13th, 2022. 18 days ago, Russia invaded Ukraine to near-unanimous global condemnation. We have been covering the war in Ukraine since March 3rd. That involves working our day jobs, then coming home and putting together a summary of the day's events. Sometimes we release our episodes a day late, sometimes 2 days late. It's always our goal to make sure our information is accurate and complete, and that our opinions, our editorials, are well informed. Today we're going to add clarity to our previous reporting. We believe this is necessary because we jumped into our coverage nearly a week after the war began. We're also going to take a moment to appreciate the efforts of the journalists who bring you, and us, the stories from inside Ukraine. So what is Ukraine? Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe by land mass, second in physical size to Russia. It has a peacetime population of 43 million, though 2.5 million refugees have fled Ukraine for neighboring countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and even Belarus. Regions of Ukraine are called oblasts, which are political and administrative divisions of a country. For U.S. listeners, it may help to imagine an oblast as a state, each with their own capitals and suburbs. To get a full understanding of where we are in the war in Ukraine, the following cities and oblasts are under Russian control or occupation. In Chernihiv Oblast, northern Ukraine near the Belarusian border, Horodina, Semenivka, Novorod-Seversky, Rybki, and Mina are all under Russian control. Chernihiv proper experienced 3 air raids overnight, last night, March 12th, damaging several high-rises, resulting in 1 death, 1 injury. Kherson Oblast, southern Ukrainian port city on both the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, Nova Kakhovka, Oleshki, and Nova Zubrivka are reportedly under Russian control. Kherson proper came under Russian control March 2nd. Kiev Oblast in northern Ukraine, where capital city Kiev is located. Kiev is not under Russian control, but Russian troops have clearly made it the primary target of their invasion. In the Kiev Oblast, Chernobyl, Hostomel and the Hostomel Airport, Irpin, Ivankiv, Kavdievo, Tarasova, Forzel, Dimer, Krasyachi, and Slavidich have been occupied by Russian troops. In the Mykolaiv Oblast, southern Ukraine, northwest of Kherson, and a 2-hour drive from the port city Odessa, Shevnikova is under Russian control, while Mykolaiv itself has been under increased shelling over the last few days. Mykolaiv is a strategic city on the road to Odessa. Controlling Odessa would put Russia in control of the entire southern coast of Ukraine, covering the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, allowing Russia a protective buffer to secure Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. Zaporizhia Oblast in southern Ukraine sits on the Dnipro River. Zaporizhia saw an assault on its nuclear power plant last week, raising concerns around the world of Russia's indiscriminate targeting of Ukraine's infrastructure. Russia controls much of the Zaporizhia Oblast. The cities of Berdyansk, Enerhodar, Melitopol, Polohi, Tomkok, and Vasilivk are all under Russian control. On March 11th, 2022, Melitopol's mayor, Ivan Fedorov, was abducted by Russian soldiers and a new mayor was installed by the Russian occupiers. The abduction of Melitopol mayor, Ivan Fedorov, brings us to our next section. What is Russia's ultimate goal for this war, and how are they going to achieve it? After Melitopol mayor Ivan Fedorov was abducted, Galina Danilchenko was installed in his place. Danilchenko previously served as the city council deputy for the opposition bloc, a Russian separatist political party that was established in 2014. Danilchenko was put on local television and told citizens not to resist the Russian occupation and that her goal was to get, quote, back to normal, end quote. But 2,000 Melitopol citizens joined in protest yesterday against the abduction of the democratically elected Mayor Fedorov. The installation of a new mayor and her subsequent television address stating, quote, "There are still people in the city who are trying to destabilize the situation, who are calling on you to take extremist actions," end quote, marks the beginning of a new change in narrative for the Russian forces. Residents of Melitopol who had been defending their homes are now and in the future going to be labeled extremists, enemies of the state. This opens the door for targeting civilians as the conflict continues, executions performed in the name of upholding order and suppressing extremist measures. This will unfortunately be the future for more cities taken by Russian forces. And less than 24 hours later, in Dnipro-Rudny, just north of Melitopol on the Dnipro River, Russian forces abducted Mayor Yevhen Matveyev. The abduction of Matveyev was denounced by the Vice President of the European Commission, Joseph Boris Fontels. Quote, It is yet another attack on democratic institutions in Ukraine and an attempt to establish illegitimate alternative government structure in a sovereign country, end quote. Russia's approach in Ukraine has been pretty straightforward if poorly executed. The abduction of elected officials suggests Russia's military presence in occupied cities is more than just to provide tactical advantage, but to establish new pro-Russian governments to incorporate into Russian territory. Ukraine's southern coast borders the Black Sea to the west, the Sea of Azov to the east, and the Crimean Peninsula to the south. Dnipro-Rudny is nearly 170 kilometers inland from the Crimean Peninsula. Major Ukrainian cities along or near the southern coast are Mariupol, Melitopol, Novokakova, Skadovsk, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. Mariupol has been surrounded by Russian land and sea offensives for over 2 weeks, cutting its 400,000 residents off from all utilities, food, and medical aid. Of all these cities, only Odessa has been spared from Russian attacks, though anticipation is growing that they will begin any day. Taking these cities would put Russia in control of southern Ukraine, with Mariupol being a major target. Mariupol is in the southwest corner of the Donetsk oblast. Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts are in eastern Ukraine and share eastern borders with Russia. They make up the Donbas region, which is where war has been ongoing since 2014. You may have heard of it. In 2016, the Ukrainian Security Service released a telephone intercept from 2014 between Russian presidential advisor Sergei Glazyev, Russian politician Konstantin Zachulin, and Denis Yatsyuk, among others, on the phone call, in which the funding of pro-Russian activists and the occupation of administration buildings was discussed. Nobody on the call has denied its authenticity, and they have been asked. Denis Yatsyuk, one of those on the call, was one of the leaders of the Odessa Druzina anti-Maidan organization and was one of the instigators of the creation of the Odessa's People Republic. This is a direct copy of how the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic in the Donbas region was formed. In that phone call, Zachulin, quote, "We have financed Kharkiv, financed Odessa." Glazyev, quote, "It is necessary to storm regional state administration and gather regional deputies there." Yatsyuk, quote, "So after storming the regional state administration, we gather a session of the regional state administration, right? We invite MPs and force them to vote?" End quote. In 2018, Yatsyuk was found guilty of infringing on, quote, "the territorial integrity and inviolability of Ukraine," end quote, by the Primorsky District Court of Odessa. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Again, Zachulin and Glazyev have not denied the authenticity of the phone recordings. Galina Danilchenko, the newly installed mayor of Melitopol, well, she is one of those, quote, "regional deputies," end quote, put in place by the Russian-backed separatists. Russia's offensive in Ukraine appears to follow the same playbook, albeit on a much larger scale, as the invasions of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and we're already seeing how Russian forces are meant to take control. Heavy artillery and airstrikes to decimate its targets, putting psychological pressure on citizens to capitulate to Russia's demands. Russian-appointed figureheads put in control of Ukrainian cities. Regional control to be solidified by its main offensive on Kiev. As Russian troops have advanced, their positions have clarified Russia's overall goal: permanently seize the previously occupied territories, likely a non-negotiable feature of any offer of peace and military withdrawal. In February of 2014, the 27th and 28th, armed Russian separatists seized the regional government and parliament buildings and controlled the airport in Simferopol and Sevastopol, where they remained in control until the May 25th referendum that has been internationally rejected, and that is the referendum that put Russia in control of the peninsula. The referendum was held illegally. Any change in Crimea's status must be voted on by the whole of Ukraine, including those who do not reside in Crimea. When Russia's war against Ukraine began 3 weeks ago, an open letter penned by the Crimean Studies Network added context to the heavily pro-Russian population. Quote, "Russia continued its occupation of Crimea for the last 8 years, attempting to change demographic realities on the ground by settling at least 500,000 Russians to the peninsula and engaging in widespread intimidation and human rights violations." End quote. Further, quote, "We demand that in the negotiations after the war, Crimea's status and Donbas region must never be compromised and sacrificed to Russia as a bargaining chip, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine must be fully restored." End quote. Yesterday's episode was on the relentless propaganda machine meant to sow doubt and confusion about the war in Ukraine. While it may not be enough for people to switch from pro-Ukraine to pro-Russia, that is not even the point of such propaganda. The act of sowing doubt and confusion, as was the point of yesterday's episode, is to splinter support. That's what leads to the general public cooling on trying to sway support or aid from their governments. If you read or see something that makes you question whether you should be in support of Ukraine, it's important to remember that there are journalists working in Ukraine to ensure that the events that take place there are recorded and reported accurately. This podcast has to be careful with its coverage because we are not a first-hand account. We've been pretty transparent about this. I think we scour dozens of articles, videos, transcripts every day for every episode. We fact check. We even look at pro-Russian propaganda to understand how truth is either silenced or twisted to match their preferred narrative. And we are grateful to the journalists embedded in Ukraine. Under the 1949 Geneva Convention, it is against international humanitarian law to attack and kill journalists. And yet it happens anyway. They put themselves on the line to bring you truth. To date, 2 active journalists have been killed by Russian troops in Ukraine. Yevgeny Sakun, a 49-year-old correspondent and camera operator for Ukrainian TV station Live, was killed when the transmission tower in Kiev was struck by a Russian rocket on March 1st. Targeting media facilities and their workers is a war crime. Brent Renaud, a 51-year-old journalist and filmmaker, was shot in the neck Sunday, March 13th, in Irpin. The photographer working alongside him, Juan Arredondo, was wounded and taken to a hospital where he was briefly interviewed.
Tell me please, what is your name?
Juan.
Juan? Where are you from?
The U.S.
Yes. What happened to you?
We crossed the first bridge in Irpin. We were going to film other refugees leaving, and we got into a car. Somebody offered to take us to the other bridge, and we crossed a checkpoint, and they started shooting at us. So the driver turned around, and they kept shooting. It's 2 of us. My friend is Brent Renaud, and he's been shot and left behind.
And how is he?
I don't know.
You don't know. You don't know what happened to him.
I saw him being shot in the neck, and we got split, and I got pulled into the.
And who brought you here?
An ambulance. I don't know.
Guillaume Briquet, 58, was shot and assaulted by Russian troops and robbed of the cash he had on hand, 3,000 euros, as he was traveling toward Mykolaiv, March 6th. Adnan Khan and Habib Demirki, working for London-based Al Arabi TV, came under fire by Russian troops March 6th in Irpin. They survived. A crew of 5, 4 British nationals and 1 Ukrainian working for Sky News, were attacked by a Russian reconnaissance unit as they were on their way to Bucha, February 28th. Stuart Ramsey was shot in the back. Richie Mockler was shot, but the bullets were stopped by his bulletproof vest. They abandoned the well-marked press car and took refuge in a nearby garage.
But the government has warned for days of Russian saboteurs who've infiltrated the country to bring terror. Death squads who are attacking civilians in their cars as they flee. They do exist, as we found out.
Oh, that's a tire, isn't it?
Oh, that's a bullet.
That was a bullet.
Right?
No, it wasn't a bullet.
It wasn't. Something blew up under us.
Something went bang.
Okay.
Oh, there's a big fuck off hole.
Okay. Oh,
What's a bullet?
okay.
Yeah.
Wait.
Whoa! Whoa! What the f***? Whoa! 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 Stop! Where the f*** is everyone?
All of the Sky News team survived. Božtak Bohash and Majda Slamova, Czech reporters for Voxpot, along with 2 more Ukrainian reporters, came under fire while driving in Makariv, March 3rd. They survived. Stefan Weikert and colleague Emil Mikkelsen, Danish reporters, both received multiple gunshot wounds in Okturka on February 26 while traveling in their marked car. They survived. In times of war, journalists are easy to distinguish. When they travel, their cars display large signs that say press, usually in the front and rear windows and on the sides. They wear jackets that say press. They display white flags or bands. Their weapons are their stories. And they brought you these updates. Today, March 13th, 2022, in Irpin outside of Kiev, Ukrainian forces have destroyed a pontoon bridge placed by Russians across the Irpin River. It is the second known use of a pontoon bridge by Russian troops. The first one was located in the north across the Pripyat River in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Also today, Russian forces have begun to move westward, targeting the city of Lviv near the Polish border. The attack appears to be a follow-through or threat of a follow-through on Russia's announcement yesterday that it would target convoys of military shipments entering Ukraine from other nations. The direct target of the attack was the Yavoriv military training camp, funded mostly by the United States, where U.S. and NATO forces regularly hold joint training sessions with the Ukrainian military. 35 people were killed in the attack, leaving 134 wounded. Lviv had been a safe harbor for Ukrainians fleeing west to evacuate the country. It sits 70 kilometers from the Polish border and had not been under Russian attack until yesterday. Russia's Navy has also reportedly cut off the whole nation from its maritime supply chain, effectively blocking ships from entering the Black Sea or reaching Ukraine's port cities there. And yesterday evening, March 12, 2022, Igor Kosov, a journalist writing for the Kiev Independent, published war stories. Evacuees risk their lives as they flee to Kiev. While many Ukrainians have fled Ukraine for Western Europe, some who lived closest to the capital city Kiev decided their safest bet would be to evacuate to the capital itself. The full article can be found at kievindependent.com. An excerpt follows. Bucha. The town of Bucha has been the site of many horror stories of people trapped, unable to reach their families, or simply being gunned down in the streets. The Kiev Independent source in the medical field in Bucha reported digging mass graves over the past 2 days. Dmytro Tkachuk, a Bucha resident, posted a tale of his family's escape from the town on Facebook on March 8th. Quote, "In the beginning of March, we went out to get drinking water from the pump, came to the end of the street, and ran into enemy armor, marked with the letter V. We turned around and went home. Fear paralyzed the mind, but the body still moved." End quote. Airstrikes had ripped through the town, demolishing and igniting buildings, forcing the family to relocate to the basement, which had a temperature of 5 to 7 degrees Celsius. Eventually, a Russian tank drove onto their street and fired directly into the second house over from theirs, according to Tkachuk. The tank then struck the cupola of a church just down the street. Quote, "The sound was like all the bell towers in the world ringing at the same time," Tkachuk wrote. When he saw Russian squads walking around peeking into people's windows, he realized there was no sense in waiting around any longer. The neighbors joined his family when they saw them leaving. As locals, they knew all the small paths and side streets, letting them avoid the Russian checkpoint. After resting in an Irpin church, they had to move across a field to get to the river crossing. Soldiers told them that as soon as they heard a whistling sound, they had mere seconds to dive to the ground. The advice came in handy almost immediately. As they moved across the field, numerous rounds came hurtling in, throwing up explosions and demolishing buildings on both sides of the bridge. The family was fleeing with their 2 grandmothers. On the way to the crossing, one of the grandmother's legs gave out, forcing Tkachuk and his sister to carry her, while lugging around a suitcase with his valuables. Quote, "The granny was screaming for us to leave her and run for the bridge," he wrote. "If that's not hell, what is?" They huddled under the bridge with the other frightened people. Moving forward was too dangerous while shells were flying. Eventually, a Ukrainian soldier cleared them to advance. A soldier on the other side screamed for Tkachuk to run, but with the weight of his grandmother and his belongings, he couldn't run. As he was crossing the open space, he was thinking, "Just not a shell. Just not a shell. Please." "When we entered Kiev, I cried," he wrote. And lastly, we want to correct our reporting from last Sunday's episode, Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. We reported on an unknown girl singing Let It Go in a shelter somewhere. Well, we have a little bit more information. The girl's name is Amelia Anisovich, aged 7. She and her mother Lila were staying in a bomb shelter in Kiev. They stayed in the shelter for 6 days before making a 2-day journey to the Polish border. Amelia and her brother Misha are staying with their grandmother in Poland. Her mother Lila and father Roman stayed behind in Ukraine. And this has been the update on the war in Ukraine for March 13th, 2022. We close out this episode with Andrei Kilvnyuk, singer for the Ukrainian band Boombox. He returned to Ukraine, ending his band's North American tour to fight for his country. Here he is stationed in Kiev, February 27th, singing There is a Red Viburnum in the Meadow.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну Хе-хе, розвесела.